So Nick, one of the things that's helpful for us in this discussion is you have the unique experience of having implemented the VPRAI and also and then transitioning from the VPRAI to the PSA. And it would be great if you can kind of talk to us about your experience and how that came about.
Sure. Well, and I obviously touched on some elements in the previous slide. So, um, but I always like to start with sort of like just the background, the history of Milwaukee County pretrial, and also just to give you a sense of how big Milwaukee County is. Milwaukee County, the county population is just shy of 1 million residents. It's the largest city in the state of Wisconsin. I've mentioned that before. Has some sort of unique problems or unique situations, given the fact that we are 45 minutes to 60 minutes away from downtown Chicago. So we can get a lot of traffic to a large portion of the population in the Midwest very quickly. And that impacts the way Milwaukee is viewed sort of throughout the state. So we were the first pretrial program in the state of Wisconsin to move to the PSA. There are now other jurisdictions that are moving towards the PSA throughout the state of Wisconsin. There's, I think, 7 or 8 pilot sites that are currently in various stages of implementation. And we get, for better or worse, we're sort of pushed on as or claimed or called the state of Milwaukee within Wisconsin, which, especially in the pretrial context or the criminal justice context, can sort of shift and shape people's views of whatever we do. So I just want people to be aware of it. A lot of people were suspect when we moved to the PSA, just simply because we were Milwaukee County moving towards the PSA, having nothing to do with the results or anything else. So the other sort of historic background that I like to talk about is also about sort of the history of pretrial in Milwaukee County. Milwaukee County was one of probably the first dozen or 24 counties to implement pretrial programs. They had sort of a fits and stops in the late 1960s, but finally sort of hit their footing in the mid 1970s. I have a very unique perspective on the history because my dad was actually involved in starting the pretrial program in the 70s, which is sort of a cool bit of history. I've also basically become the historian of Milwaukee County's pretrial program because of that, because no one else was around anymore from the mid 1970s. So in Milwaukee County in the early 1980s, actually started what was called the bail evaluation unit, and was specifically focused on interviewing every single defendant prior to their initial appearance who was in the Milwaukee County Jail. That lasted from the 1982, 83-ish to the late 90s, actually, when I started my career. And in 1999, the Milwaukee County stakeholders asked for an audit of pretrial services. And they said, hey, we're spending a lot of money in pretrial services. We're not sure what we're getting out of it. And we want to take a deeper dive. And the audit came back frankly pretty disappointing for pretrial. And the biggest disappointment was specifically about the bail evaluation unit was we had lost sight and lost connection with our stakeholders. We had not only judges who weren't listening to the risk assessments or our bail recommendations, we had prosecutors, and we even had defense attorneys who wanted nothing to do with what we were providing. So in 2000, the program was shut down. We no longer did bail evaluation. We still did supervision, which you can imagine the ramifications of that. Had a huge impact on the number of people and the appropriateness of the focus on supervision. And I was very happy to say that from 2000 to 2010, there was a quick realization from the stakeholders that was a bad decision to get rid of screening. They didn't like the way that it was done, but they also realized the need to have that screening portion as part of the integral part of the system. So having no screening was sort of status quo until 2006 when we had a new district attorney elected. Prior to that, we had a wonderful district attorney named Michael McCann, who was fantastic, but had been a prosecutor, been the elected county prosecutor since 1968. At the time, he was the longest tenured district attorney in the entire country. And John Chisholm, who was elected in 2006, had just completely new vision for what prosecutors need to do. And his platform, even though it was not directly related to what we've been talking about, had an impact. And his platform he ran on is, we need to increase diversion programming. And his first comment was, well, how do I figure out who's eligible for diversion? So we actually started doing sort of this, hallway screens for people that the DA said, hey, we want you to take a look at this person. We would do a criminogenic risk assessment, and then provide that information to the prosecutors, and then they would make referrals for diversion. Well, why was that important? Well, that was the first opportunity for us to talk about what risk assessment is with prosecutors since basically 2000. Defense bar knew that there's this value to have pretrial risk assessments. The prosecutors were not super huge fans of it. So that program started the conversation of going, well, maybe we need to look at how are we making bail recommendations. And the research came out pretty astoundingly, is that most of the prosecutors that were located in our initial appearance court, almost all of them were asking for money bond on every single person that was coming through, no matter what the charge, no matter what it was. And that was, now the judges didn't necessarily follow that, or we call them commissioners instead of magistrates, but similar concept. The commissioners didn't necessarily follow that suggestion, but it was problematic because the prosecutors had this anchoring effect and in the arguments, not only for a money bond, but also in conditions. So these conversations around increased diversion led to this collaborative, informal collaboration between the judges, the district attorneys, and the public defenders and pretrial. And that grew, and it took a while. I mean, in 2007, people were like, we're not really sure if it's going to work. We'll see. Well, 3 years later in 2010, there was actually a really sound group of people that were meeting regularly to talk about diversion processes. And we have both pre-charge and post-charge diversions. So the post-charge diversions were where we looped in judicial officials because they're going to still be hearing cases. You need to be part of this process. And then we started talking about an opportunity to take part in the National Institute of Corrections Evidence-Based Decision-Making Initiative, which was released in 2010, I believe. There was an opportunity to apply for that. We felt like we had a good collaborative base, and we applied for it, and we were selected as one of the seven pilot sites in 2011. And I was really happy to say that when we started selecting change targets, which again was a collaborative process, we had 25 people in the room throwing out every single change target that was imaginable. I think we had, at the end of the day, we had 120 some odd change targets, individual change targets that we wanted to take on. Universal screening was unanimously chosen as the easiest one for us to implement. It was low-hanging fruit. We were already doing the screening. We just needed to enhance it and sort of shift and change the development or the structure of how we were doing the screening. So that's when we started working with Dr. Marie Van Nostrand. We adopted a version of the VPRAI with some modifications, which we called the MCPRAI, the Milwaukee County Pretrial Risk Assessment Instrument. We even had it long enough where we validated it again. So then we had the MCPRAI-R. Again, sounds pretty familiar with what Virginia's gone through. And we had a matrix, just like everyone else did with the VPRAI. And that was going fairly well. And it was going well from really 2012 to 2016. And then we got another call from Marie, and Marie was like, hey, you've got this new opportunity for you to take a look at. I'd be interested in you taking a look at this new tool, the PSA. And we had heard about it, and we had certainly expressed interest in being involved in the PSA. We had provided data for the PSA validation that I don't think ultimately was used, but we at least were involved in the process. And in 2015, we made the decision that we're going to make the switch. And that involved a number of hurdles that we had to overcome. And I've made reference to this before. A couple of the hurdles that we had to overcome was, again, defining what a violent offense was. We literally went through every single criminal statute and, every sub statute. So we have probably the most comprehensive list in the state of Wisconsin now of every single criminal statute. And that took us a couple reviews because there were some things that we could easily just go, okay, this entire section we know is nonviolent, or this entire section we know is violent. But then we got into that nuanced issues. We had, for example, burglaries in the state of Wisconsin. We can have a burglary of a garage where they don't make any entry. They steal a lawnmower or whatever lawn equipment out of the garage. No contact with the resident. And then we can also have, forcible entry burglaries that are charged under the same main statute. So then we obviously had to go to sub-statutes to clarify that. And some of the statutes weren't even clear. Burglary, for example, could be charged whether a simple non-confrontational garage burglary or an in-person forcible burglary are literally the same statute in Wisconsin. So we said, okay, we want to differentiate those two. So we literally have, that's one of the few statutes that we as a pretrial organization have to go in and read the criminal complaint and figure out, okay, is that a forcible entry burglary or is that not? So that's one of the weird places where we do have we've inserted some subjectiveness because we weren't comfortable with the current definition, but in most cases, that's a one out of all of our statutes. Other big hurdle that we ran into was a technology issue. We needed access to NCIC. I don't know if every county has access to NCIC right now, criminal records. So for us, we didn't. So we had to work through that. And that was, over a year of dealing not only with state folks, but also federal folks. And then sort of a philosophical change that we had to address in the pretrial field was just being comfortable only measuring risk on static factors. When I started in pretrial, we actually had separated units for individuals with substance abuse, separated units for people who had mental health issues, separated from people with general crimes. So even when we looked at differential supervision, we were very concerned with the dynamic factors that played a part with an individual coming into the system. That was a part of our organizational culture that we had to reevaluate and certainly do a lot of education and instruction internally. And then sort of the final hurdle that I want to talk about is the IT requirements and the data capture requirements. We talked about that earlier in the standards, the need to be able to capture as many outcomes as you possibly can so that you can do validation reports, but also so that hopefully, in theory, that you can start looking at new risk factors. And when you're doing validation, you can actually take a look at additional factors other than the ones that you're capturing for the PSA. So we had to redo our entire data system. That was another lengthy process. It took us over 2 years to do. Meanwhile, we're still in the process of switching over from the VPRAI R to the PSA. So those were the big sort of hurdles that we had to address. And that's not even talking about, again, all the collaboration and all the conversations and the education that we had to do with every stakeholder. The one thing that I would say that was valuable is that we had sort of an executive committee that oversaw all of this work, and it was interdisciplinary. We had everyone from judges, prosecutors, to defense bar, to a large contingent of pretrial population, to court administrators. We invited our county executive, so we had county executive representation from time to time. We invited our county board to be part of this conversation. Victim services, we invited to be part of the conversation, just so that we were trying to be as transparent as possible in all of the decisions and all the conversations that we had. And I found that to be pretty successful in the grand scheme of things. Did we, again, run into some of those issues where we had some significant disagreement? Yes. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it worked out very, very well in the grand scheme of things. Sure, did we have arguments and not agree on everything? Yes, but we at least were able to reach some consensus. I would say the biggest benefit for us, and we've touched on this a little bit, using static factors allowed us to provide risk assessment information on every single defendant. Whether they were drunk, whether they were high, whether they were in a disciplinary pod or unit, whether they told us, I don't want to talk to you. which happened a lot at times, we had the ability to provide pretrial risk assessment information to every single case. It also allowed us to create differential supervision, which again, we talked about that a little bit earlier. We're going to manage people who are high risk for failure to appear different than people who are high risk for new criminal activity. Simple as that. And then it also, I think the biggest piece for us, it provided us a vehicle to capture data and then report on outcomes in a consistent and transparent way. That may not seem obvious, right? You guys have the VPRAI, you already have that to some extent, but because we went through this collaborative process and we went through this educational process side by side with many of the stakeholders, or at least representatives of the stakeholders, they had a different understanding of the outcomes and the data than what they had prior to that. They understood what a 3-3 is all of a sudden. And if I ran into an issue with a judge, I knew which judge I could go to. I could go to Judge Kremers and, hey, Judge Kremers, will you mind talking to this judge? This person doesn't understand this aspect and they're not listening to me. Creating those almost champions for pretrial risk assessment instruments were really, really valuable in the long run. So that's sort of where I know we've got another slide where I want to highlight maybe some other benefits, but that's sort of the Milwaukee experience. Again, like I said, the really dicey spots, we sort of covered that already. There are a lot of them, again, but I think the biggest piece is the collaboration, the transparent conversations, the opportunity to educate. All of those things feed into a stronger and more viable pretrial service agency at the end of the day in local jurisdictions. If you're not having those regular conversations, and when I look back at the audit that happened in the late 90s, that's the reason why the audit happened, because we had lost that communication, we had lost that collaboration, we had lost those ties to those important stakeholders. And frankly, at the end of the day, they didn't know what we were doing. So here we were submitting reports and they were looking at it and going, well, I disagree with this, forget it, I'm not going to look at it anymore. Or even at worse is that some of the newer stakeholders saw it and they were like, I don't even know what this is, so I'm just going to ignore it. And both of those are losing propositions for pretrial practitioners and pretrial service agencies in the long run. So that's all I got, Ken.
Well, that's well said, and I think you're exactly bringing up kind of the challenges that we need to kind of face and that we've experienced ourselves. So your story, I think, is definitely not unique. It it's the little twists and turns might be different here and there, but I think and I don't know if Wes wants to chime in, but about our experience, but those are valuable things I think to hear.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that, Ken. The similarities are there, and it all really stems back to education, relationship, and collaboration across platforms, across stakeholders.
Yep. All righty, well, thank you, Nick. And so we are in the home stretch here, so I appreciate everybody being patient, but this has been a great conversation, and I would not want to cut it short. But in kind of getting towards the end here, one of my favorite quotes is from Judge Bruce Bowden, and Judge Bowden was part of starting pretrial services in Washington, D.C. back in the 60s, and actually was kind of like the grandfather of sorts of NAPSA. And Bruce used to do a pretrial 101 training seminar at the NAPSA conferences, and I got this from him, and I think this is one of those quotes that I think is kind of timeless in the work that we do, and especially now that we're facing some crisis and challenge, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's making sure that the tools that we're using are fair. And so part of that is, ensuring racial bias and things of that nature are not part of what we do. Our job is to filter through that. And I'll read the quote real quick, and I'd like to hear from you guys and your thoughts on, kind of these topics. But, Bruce says, our challenge to the delivery of administration of real justice depends directly on our ability to balance considerations of right and wrong, always looking inward to our scales of fundamental fairness to see whether what we have constructed is fair. So Nick, I'll start with you if you want to jump in and kind of talk about your experience. I think, you know, for one, you know, with what you've done and the changes you described in your practices, you know, talk about some of the challenges with addressing the pandemic and how you overcome some of those barriers and and how you persist.
Yeah. So, you know, when we talk about racial justice, I think it's really easy to just say, hey, risk assessment tools are treating people equally no matter what the context an individual lives in, whether, you know, it's socioeconomic disparity, whether it's racial disparities. It doesn't matter. An 18-year-old with no criminal record is going to be scored no matter whether they are white, African-American, Latino, whatever. It doesn't matter. I think we have to flip things a little bit on its head because I feel like this whole process is evolutionary. Like one of the great things, one of the most powerful statements that I heard recently, again, was from an NIC statement and the Evidence-Based Decision-Making Initiative. One of their principles is that we can always do better. You know, and it was a lot more nuanced and a lot more poetic than what I just said. But ingraining that into what we do, to me, is the most important part of the pretrial service agency perspective, is that we have the ability to sort of be the data keepers. We have the ability to be the truth tellers. We have the ability to sort of filter through the political context and say, hey, these are the people who are coming into the criminal justice system. This is the risk levels they face. This is the criminal history that they have. This is where they're coming from. This is their background. We have that record, and we have to figure out, again, how to share that so that we're not immediately dismissed. But it's important for us to capture that information. And the same thing with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the same issue, is that just because we're dealing with a pandemic doesn't mean all of a sudden the wheels of the criminal justice system can just stop so that people are incarcerated indefinitely because there's no court hearings. I don't know what jurisdictions across Virginia are doing, but our court system in Milwaukee County is basically shut down except for cases that they absolutely have to hear. So we have people that are being released in Milwaukee County that aren't given a court date. If you can imagine that, they're just said, "Hey, we'll let you know when we're going to open up court." You can imagine my skin starts sort of crawling when I hear that, because my first question to the courts are, "Well, how are you going to find them? How are you going to communicate with them?" And then what is that going to do to the failure to appear rates 6 months from now when you all of a sudden open up and you can only reach 5% of the people that you've released without court dates, right? How are defendants going to be able to, their procedural justice is going to be protected when they may not have been able to have contact with their defense attorney for 6 months? And then the reverse also for prosecutors. How do you find witnesses or victims 6 months, 7 months, 8 months after the pandemic? So those are all the things that, you know, again, I think is really challenging to the criminal justice system. I think that the interesting thing about, at least from the pretrial side, that we've been fairly successful with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and specifically the administration of risk assessments, is because we were able to use, or because we shifted to the PSA, we're still able to do universal screening almost exactly the way that we do universal screening prior to the pandemic. We're still running PSAs. We have access to NCIC through a specific terminal that's in the jail, that's in a locked closet. So we have random people, you know, and I shouldn't say random, but we have scheduled people that go in every day, and that's all they do is run the NCIC records. Everything else is basically electronic. We submit our pretrial risk assessment reports through e-filing. So we can still make sure that at least our part of the criminal justice system continues to move forward, and that we're not all of a sudden dropping the ball on, people that are arrested and detained, and all of a sudden a judicial official doesn't have a pretrial risk assessment score or a report. So that's been probably the biggest piece. Ironically, we actually had a test run of this several years ago when our courthouse had an electrical fire and basically shut down our courthouse operations completely. So we were sort of prepped, not necessarily for the length of time that this is taking, but certainly for the crisis of going, okay, we don't have access all of a sudden to all these courtrooms. We don't have access to our facilities. How do we do this? So it's sort of a weird tie-in, but it's certainly, I think, an important tie-in to say the PSA makes it to some extent, and I sort of feel weird saying this because it is a weird statement to say, but it made us a little bit more resilient against this crisis scenario. We're still able to do our job for the most part. Now, on the supervision side, it's completely different, but at least on the screening side, we were able to continue that operations as normal.
So Wes, obviously you use the VPRAI, and I guess from your thoughts from the perspective of your agency overall, and how did you guys approach, what was your response to the barriers and the challenges that we experienced through the pandemic?
So both offices have an investigator role that their primary function is to go into the jails every morning pretty early and interview those eligible for the pretrial investigation. And that's typically done face-to-face in close proximity with that individual. And so it took a lot of coordination and collaboration with both jails in order to adapt to what their protocols looked like and changed to, and the limits on movement within the facilities based off of the outbreak, and trying to limit exposure and potential an outbreak inside a facility. And so both of ours, I think, went to the no contact visitation booth sort of through a barrier and a window, communicating to get to that VPRAI investigative interview aspect. And so for the most part, we didn't miss a beat in the grand scheme of things as far as our current procedure operations and getting the interview completed. There obviously, that requires staff to be resilient and open to going into a facility under these conditions. And it just, for me, it speaks volumes to the quality of officers that we have doing the work every single day, day in and day out, under the conditions that we are facing as a society. And just speaks to the type of individual that chooses to do this work. And so, we've been able to I think, because we're blessed with only one facility in which we have to enter each day, and the relationship that both facilities have with our agencies, and being open and very welcoming, just to have us come in and do this job every single day under normal circumstances, and then that enabled them to be considerate of us, to still know that our role was a core essential function of the justice system, and that needed to still take place, and collaborate with us in that way. And granted, across Virginia, I know there are many different places that are facing different challenges as relates to that. Some have multiple jails across jurisdictions that they have to deal with and try to adhere to whatever guidelines and things that they have. So I know that's not the same story that other folks would tell across the state, and the same challenges. Yet I do know that having to do the interview could potentially impact the overall equity and fairness in this time right now that we're dealing with, because there may be places that are completely suspended, or it looks very different, or maybe it's even much more confined as to who might be eligible under the circumstances. And like I say, may not even be able to provide pretrial investigations at this time. Thankfully for our agency and our situations, we've been able to do that and adjust fairly well under the circumstances, and still be able to get a quality interview conducted. While it would be great for us to be able to do it by video or whatnot, not even have to enter the facility, we're still doing that every day, and being able to do that as best we can under the circumstances. It's been pretty awesome to see, to be quite honest with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's, it just warms my heart to hear you describe the courage and the dedication of the staff that are doing what they do, and that does speak volumes to your agency, and I think in large measure to a lot of the staff around the state, and that's really something I think we really respect and appreciate. So it just sounds like as we kind of look at the two tools in the pros and cons and how it interrelates into this, and both seem to address the bias issue. And the utility is one I think that I think as we move forward in Virginia perhaps needs consideration, and the way Nick described his ability to make sure that his commitment and goal of universal screening and reaching that sounds like it was largely uninterrupted and continued forward. Wes was able to describe how his agency kind of kept the ball rolling, but maybe more of unique to what he was able to do based on his local resources and things of that nature. So a lot goes into that. Any other thoughts about the PSA? And we'll have a chance for closing thoughts, but as it relates to the issues we're talking here.
So Ken, I think the other thing that I would put out there that I don't have personal experience, although I'm hoping to get some personal experience with this, and may be relevant when the Commonwealth decides to move forward with the PSA implementation, is the idea of how a maybe local crisis could be handled, and the share of and the weight of pretrial screening could be shared across multiple jurisdictions. One of the things that we're sort of toying around with, but at New Mexico, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but Kelly Bradford is working on it, is the ability to do remote screening using the PSA. So for example, if I'm using Wisconsin, because I won't screw up counties' names, if Dane County, which is Madison, and Milwaukee County are both using the PSA, let's say something happens in Milwaukee County to prevent us from being able to do screens. There's no reason that the folks in Dane County can't actually do the screens using the PSA once they have the information of the defendants coming through. And then again, that information can still be shared with the courts. So you actually have no lag, even if the crisis or an emergency is localized. New Mexico is exploring that, but that again is a statewide approach. But again, another thing that as you're continuing to develop, maybe an opportunity for dealing with, maybe it's not a crisis per se, maybe it's just frankly a big event that all of a sudden, spurs more arrests and a jurisdiction is overwhelmed and can't keep up. Is there an opportunity to partner with other jurisdictions that could come in and say, hey, we'll take, we can do 2 or 3 PSAs, and even though we're 150 miles away, give us the names, we'll do the run of the reports and get it back to you, so that again, that ball doesn't get dropped. We think a lot about that in Milwaukee County, because if there's an example, we were talking about the DNC, another thing that sort of prepped us for this crisis. We were preparing to be shut down for basically a week when the DNC came to town in Milwaukee. So we had all these emergency plans, and we talked about, again, are there ways for us to sort of farm out the PSA to other jurisdictions across the state? So just another potential advantage.
Yeah, that is a fascinating thing to say, and and maybe that's the opportunity, and not knowing how this unfolds and what the discussions are, but it definitely affords the opportunity to kind of think outside the box a little bit in terms of allocation of resources to accomplish a common goal. And yeah, I mean, who knows? It could open up doors that we never imagined. It can be opened, and new ways of doing things.
Yeah, for me, Ken, the only thing I would chime in on that is just I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I'm going to beat it. We miss so many people in Virginia right now, and if, like you say, we want to continue to look inward at our scales of fundamental fairness and see whether what we've constructed is fair. So if we just look at that last sentence in that last bit of his quote, I think we in Virginia definitely need to look at what we're doing, and is this the most fair and equitable method of doing business and pretrial? And if not, then being open to exploring what possible options are out there in order to help us get to where we are, doing the most to line up with that, to come into the line with being equitable and fair, and not just think that we may be that way. To actually be able to say, you know, we are hitting everyone, and it is a fair system because of that, inherently so. So, yeah, I don't mean to continue to go back to it, but I can't help but not when it's just so starking in my face to see that number be so high the way it is.
I think that is it is okay to hammer home that point, and hopefully it's when we can kind of wrap our heads around and start planning around. So, all right, well, listen, I really appreciate both of you and the amount of time that you put into this and spent with us. This has been a long conversation, but I think a much needed one, and we covered a lot of territory. But I also wanted to kind of provide, an opportunity for both of you to, end with some parting thoughts and, any recommendations or thoughts as we go down the road of re-examining how we approach risk assessment in Virginia, and what should we consider. So I just want to open up to both of you about, any of your parting thoughts.
So for me, I represent both PJAC and my agency, and I know at OER we hold very dear to being to embody these values that we are talking about today. And I know that our acronym of PJAC stands for Pretrial Justice Advancement Committee. And so for me as a co-chair of that committee, and I know the high caliber of folks that make up this committee and the passion that is there and is present in all of those participants. And I hope and trust that we will continue to carry the torch across the state into pretrial and in to filtrate into our own agencies and localities, that we are continuing to advance pretrial justice in Virginia and what that looks like on a statewide and localized scale, to where we are achieving the most fair and equitable aspects and administration of pretrial justice in our state and in our communities. And that's what I hope that we're able to do, and to continue having conversations like this and to continue exploring avenues that we may not have considered before as possible options to change, to align ourselves in that way. And that's my hope, and that's where I will continue to work in any capacity that I possibly can to do that.
Yeah, so I would actually echo a lot of Wes's sentiments. I always try to think of, criminal justice reform and pretrial reform as an evolutionary process, right? And just like the evolutionary process, sometimes we take some wrong steps. There's some wrong directions, but ultimately the goal is moving towards a system that is the most fair, the most equitable. Possible. The thing I would always say, and I always butcher this, so I'm going to try not to butcher it today, is don't let the better be the victim of the perfect. So there are going to be a lot of folks, I've seen a lot of criminal justice reform say, hey, that advancement isn't perfect, so it's not worth doing. My experience has always been, and my understanding, and this might be different than a lot of folks, but having been raised sort of in the criminal justice system, is that I always had this inherent knowledge, and I was taught at a very young age, that the criminal justice system is fundamentally broken in many ways. So the idea should be, we're not going to be able to fix everything in one fell swoop. The pretrial risk assessment instrument, the PSA, is not the silver bullet for all of pretrial service agencies' ills or concerns. That's why I almost, and you've probably heard this through my comments during the entire process, has been focus on the process that you get there, the relationships, the champions, the partnerships, the credibility, which is based off of being transparent and building things off of consensus, is almost in many ways more valuable. And I should say it is more valuable than the pretrial risk assessment tool that you use. Because as Wes mentioned earlier, this is just a phase. If you decide to move forward with the PSA, this is just the PSA phase in Virginia. There's going to be a phase after the PSA. And the hope is that don't fall into the trap that the Milwaukee County Pretrial Service Agency fell into, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, when they just started ignoring the stakeholders, stopped doing outreach, stopped doing education. Think of the pretrial sort of role of providing information to the courts as being much broader than just a case-by-case basis. This is our opportunity to provide information to the stakeholders and educate them about the science behind pretrial justice and pretrial release.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Wes. I would just like to say again, thanks to VCCJA, especially the Pretrial Justice Advancement Committee and all the members of that committee and all the hard work that you guys do. I really appreciate the opportunity I have at DCJS to partner with VCCJA and and all the local agencies. I think there are so many good opportunities of the way we're structured to do some of the things that we just talked about here today. And I hope this is, I echo the sentiments of Wes and Nick that, this is a phase process, and we continue to collaborate and work together and address advancing the field of pretrial risk assessment and the field of in pretrial justice generally. So I appreciate that. And again, thanks to Wes and Nick for your expertise today. And I know that as people watch this and reach the end of this, I'm looking here and it's like 3 hours. I'm not sure if that's for the entire recording or our practice session too. But if it is, hopefully you chunked this out and you were able to reach the end, because there is so much great discussion. And I think this is really going to prove to be a nice springboard to even further discussions and getting us towards the road of advancing. So again, thank you, Wes. Thank you, Nick. And we really appreciate it. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. You guys were great.